Hi, this is Elaine Shannon from the Cipher Brief. We're talking today with Clayton Siegel, the Senior Fellow for Energy Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He knows everything that I want to know and a lot more about the world energy markets. And particularly, we're interested today in Russian oil and how it's moving, uh, mostly by the so called shadow fleet of sketchy tankers that Russia controls and we would like to stop. Welcome, Clay.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you today.
Clay, let's start off by talking about what the shadow fleet is. A lot of people don't know what it is, but it does sound ominous.
Well, Elaine, it's great to be with you. The Shadow Fleet refers to a large group of oil tanker vessels that are operating outside of international supervision and are receiving maritime insurance and other maritime services outside of the traditional Western sources. So outside of the P&I clubs and the other forms of insurance that reputable shippers and commercial agents use to move these cargoes around the world. And the shadow fleet has been employed particularly by those exporting countries that have been hit by sanctions, namely Iran, Venezuela, and Russia in recent years.
It sounds very sketchy. What are the dangers to the West, to the United States, and to our European partners if one of those uh, vessels, if something happens, if there's an oil spill or a breakdown?
Well, obviously the physical risk is that, and the environmental risk is that an oil tanker that suffers a breakdown or an oil spill would not be adequately insured, and that would have severe consequences. Certainly, from an environmental perspective, the risk of the shadow fleet from uh, a national security perspective and a policy perspective is the risk of these sanctioned tankers and entities finding workarounds and loopholes to the sanctions regimes. And so that's exactly what Russia has been trying to achieve by employing tankers in the shadow fleet, is to get around the rules associated with the sanctions that were imposed following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine almost 3 years ago to the day. And to wit, there's this price cap that the Western powers, the G7, agreed on, by which the price of Russian crude oil should be capped at $60 a barrel. And by employing the shadow fleet that has kind of sketchy control, the Russian entities that are selling that oil have, in many cases, been able to get around that price ceiling and sell their oil for greater prices than the price cap dictates.
Why did the West decide to cap oil prices for Russia rather than just say you can't sell it anymore?
Well, the G7 and the Biden administration were faced with a dilemma. They certainly wanted to crack down on Russia's oil inventory, Russia's oil revenues, the money that the Kremlin receives for selling this oil, which funds the war coffers and in part enables Putin to prosecute the war in Ukraine. And they wanted it to have teeth. At the same time, they didn't want 5 million barrels a day of Russian oil coming off of the marketplace and being removed altogether from the market. So the compromise, the balancing act here was to allow Russian exports to continue, but to try to regulate them, and specifically to regulate the price that Moscow would receive for selling this oil in order to limit those revenues.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
So on January 10th, as I recall, the Biden administration, that was just about out the door, announced a new set of sanctions. What were those designed to do? To somehow crack down on the shadow fleet, right?
That's exactly right. So two main elements of those sanctions from January 10th. The first one was they listed about 183 of these oil tanker vessels and said that these are added to the do not trade with list. And so that meant that this group of tankers that was responsible for moving a large portion, almost half, of Russia's crude oil the previous year, would be prohibited from doing so going forward. And so those last two customers of Russian crude oil, after this big reshuffle took place, India and China, as you noted, were on notice from January 10th that their ports, their oil importing companies were not allowed to do business with those tankers. And that has the effect of forcing and pushing more of Russia's oil export volumes out of the shadow fleet, where the buyers don't want to work with those ships anymore, and into the regulated, compliant fleet that is subject to the G7 rules and G7 insurance and other services. And especially important, compliant with the price cap mechanism. And so that means that Putin, at least in theory, would be forced to accept larger price discounts for the crude oil that he's selling. The other really important element of the January 10th package of sanctions is sanctions on two of the Russian oil producing companies, Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftgaz. And that means that regardless of which ships oil from those companies is transported, whether it's on the sanctioned fleet, the shadow fleet, or the compliant fleet, nobody would be allowed to do business with that oil, those entities again. I fear, however, that certain market participants will find workarounds to those new measures probably sooner rather than later.
Well, as we all know, Russian smugglers, Russian businesses have been finding workarounds for about 100 years because Moscow imposed rules. They didn't want to obey them. So they're really expert at this, right? So what do you think the workarounds are going to be like?
There's a few things to expect in order to obfuscate the origin of the cargoes as being from those two sanctioned companies. And probably step number one is to just have fraudulent sham entities within Russia in the ruble market that are going to be the first purchasers of oil from those two sanctioned companies. And once the oil is held by those, let's say, shell companies in Russia, that's already a first big step to obfuscating their origin. Because then in turn, those fraudulent shell companies in Russia can sell the oil further downstream to other entities and traders in the world oil market and on to ultimate buyers and ultimate receivers of those cargoes.
So then what happens once we figure out what the Russians are really doing? Is there any way to police this problem?
You know, it kind of reminds me of the arcade game Whack-A-Mole, where you're continuously trying to keep the bad guys down with your little foam mallet. And so the U.S. Treasury and the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which is responsible for developing the sanctions, enforcing the sanctions, is really going to have its work cut out for it, because new tankers are going to join the shadow fleet. That's inevitable. Where there's a market demand, they will find the supply of new tankers in order to fill the gap. And at the same time, as I mentioned, there will be shell companies that pick up part of the trade from the two sanctioned companies. There will also be other tricks in the bad guys' toolkit, including transfers of oil cargoes on the high seas from one ship to another with the broadcast signals turned off in an attempt to hide the trade. And then there's always the possibility of once one of these illicit cargoes is on a ship, to discharge it into a land-based terminal, you know, an oil tank in a tank farm in an oil facility. And at that point, it's kind of commingled with other oil cargoes, other parcels, and it's really nearly impossible to distinguish the one origin or one supplier from another once they're commingled in a tank. So those sanctions enforcers will have their work cut out for them to, first of all, try to stay aware as possible of what the tricks are to the trade that are being employed in the marketplace, and to try to add new entities, companies, personnel to the sanction list in order to keep it a vibrant and effective regime.
And one final technical question. Uh, how do we know where these tankers are? Uh, I believe they are required to mount transponders on them. Would you tell us how those work and how uh, uh, these illicit or gray market tankers can beat the transponder reporting system?
Sure. There's a division of the United Nations called the International Maritime Organization, or IMO, and it stipulates that all vessels, all ships that are greater than the very smallest class, are required at all times to transmit a beacon that's called the Automatic Identification System, or AIS, that includes vital data about a ship, including its heading on the compass, like what direction it's heading, its speed, and also some captain entered details like its destination and how full it is, measured by its draft. And so all of these metrics and data points are constantly being transmitted by ships all over the planet. And this enables observers to track the movement of ships, and by proxy, if you know what kind of ship it is and what it is reasonably likely to be carrying, the movement of those commodities. And there are analytical platforms and software as a service businesses that are dedicated to tracking those AIS signals and aggregating that data to come up with things like trade flow analytics and freight market dynamics. And so that's a thing in oil market world and shipping. And so one of the phenomenons that we've run into when it comes to skirting sanctions is the practice of nefarious operators turning off those broadcast signals, those automatic identification system signals, so that it makes it more difficult for third parties to track their movements, to see where they've been, for example, where they loaded an oil cargo, or potentially where they've gone and where they've discharged an oil cargo. And with that opacity, that's also another bit of a cat and mouse game that's taking place in the industry, because the trackers, the analytical platforms, are also getting better at tracking those ship-to-ship transfers, even when the AIS signals go dark. And so there's a lot of artificial intelligence applications and machine learning that go into trying to fill in the gaps when those broadcast signals go dark.
So if I'm a shady operator and I want to just disappear into the seas, when you go out onto the high seas, it looks pretty bleak. It looks pretty empty. How do I, as a shady operator, get away with it?
You know, another trick that those shady operators would employ in this case is one that we call spoofing. And that's not just as simple as cutting off the broadcast signals. It's manipulating the signals to make it look like your ship is somewhere that it isn't. It could be a different port in the same country. It could be a completely different country in a different part of the globe. And we've seen quite a few instances of this AIS location spoofing that makes it even harder for the investigators to track.
Do you spoof it by manipulating somehow a GPS signal?
It's manipulating the AIS signal. That's right.
Oh my goodness. Well, there's a lot to learn here, folks. I am going to study up more and come back to you with even better questions next time. But thank you so much, Clay, for your remarkable knowledge of this field.
Thanks, Elaine. Look forward to next time.
Thank you.